We're now going to begin a series of lessons on the UI table view. You can think of the UI table view as not really a table view per se, more like a list, although you can certainly create tables out of it. It's a very flexible control. It does a lot of things, so that's why we're going to spend multiple lessons on it. The first thing we're going to do is make a basic list. So in the storyboard, I've added my UI table view. And then in the attributes, I've set the number of prototype cells to 1. You can set more prototype cells if you want, but these are the basic template cells for each one of the cells in the table view. So I've set that to 1, and when I do that, I get this prototype cell. And I've set its identifier to cell ID. We're going to see in later lessons that we can do all of this in code. We don't need to do it in the storyboard, and sometimes it's advantageous to do it in code. The identifier is really important, as we'll see. So that's all I've done on the storyboard, except of course, I have created a referencing outlet for my table view. In the Swift code, the first thing I need to do is add an interface that I inherit from. And that interface is Uitableview data source. In view.load, I tell the table view that its data source is this view controller. I also create a string variable called cell ID and name it cell ID. And this has to match my prototype exactly. On the delegate, there are going to be a few methods that we have to implement. The first one is the number of sections in the table view. And for now, we're just going to return one section. So this will be a very plain table with just a number of cells. And we'll see about sections in our next lesson. The next function I need to work with is TableView number of rows in section. And this will pass me a section number. In our case, it's only going to call this once because there's only one section. And I'm going to return that I have 5 rows. So as the table is getting built up, it'll ask first, how many sections do I have? And then for each section, it'll ask how many rows do I have in a particular section. So we're saying we have one section and we have 5 rows. Then the last function we need to implement is TableView cell for row at index path. And the index path has 2 variables to it. It has a section number and a row number. So after the table has figured out how many sections and how many rows it has, it'll go through each row for each section and ask us for a cell. Now we have a prototype for our cell, so we want to use that. So in order to create our cell, we call the TableView DQ Reusable Cell with identifier. And we pass in that identifier that we set called cell ID. And then we also pass in the index path as a reference. Now this is a reusable cell. So what that means, if we have a long table, the cell gets reused as the user scrolls through the table. iOS by default will only actually create the cells that are visible. In that way, it saves memory. And then it will reuse the cell as the user scrolls through. So that's what this call is doing. Now that we have a cell object, we want to set its text label. And this, as you might expect, just shows the text in the cell. And we're going to create a string with the format, section number, and row number. And then we return the cell object. So that's the real basic code on creating a table. So now that we've seen that, let's see what it looks like. So I have my one section and I have my 5 rows. And each row, of course, is selectable, and you can get the standard highlight color. And I've gotten all of this by default. Now, just to be clear, we're going to put some debug points on. We're going to run it again so you can see the sequence of events. The first thing that happens, it asks for the number of sections in the table view. Moving on, it turns around and asks for the number of rows in the section. And it is passing in, well, sometimes it's very picky when you float over. But down here, we can see that the section number is actually 0. If we had more than one section, this would get called more than once, and it will return a different number perhaps for each section, or the same number depending upon our usage. And finally, it's going to call the table view with the index path, and that index path is going to have a section equal to 0 and a row equal to 1. Excuse me, it'll have a section equal to 0 and initially a row equal to 0 as well. And that's going to be the first row in the first section. And we'll build up our cell. And now we're going to have just a small distraction. And now we'll have our row equal to 1, and our section is still equal to 0. And we'll let this go. And we'll see our section 1, row 1, section 1, row 2, etc. So that's the order of the way these functions are called, and how the table view builds itself. In our next lesson, we're going to get a little bit fancier and build up some sections and see how we can hook the event of an actual table cell being clicked on.